So I'm going to cue it up. This is the conversation of data and democracy, and I think he did this in Munich, okay, in Germany. So Karp once again has this way of making known that the question that's being asked of him, he doesn't really like, and then he has to clarify it a bunch of times, changes the guy's answer at the end. I don't know if we're going to get through all this, and says, "This is what you really meant to ask me." Okay? And so there's all these things going on that just like, dude, just can you answer this a-hole's question and move on to the next question? But he can't. So let's listen for a minute.
No, everyone knows who you are.
Wait, hold on. I'm going to go back a little bit.
Excuse me. All right. Ken Roth. I'm Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch.
Here.
Excuse me. All right.
Ken Roth.
I'm Ken Roth from Human Rights Watch.
No, everyone knows who you are.
I wanted to
He doesn't like this guy.
kind of go back to the basics in terms of not data protection, but who owns the data to begin with. And I mean, we go at this philosophically because you've been speaking philosophically. The U.S., in my impression, kind of got off on the wrong foot.
I haven't seen
from,
this,
like,
by
the
the way. So I'm happy you're
troglodyte
telling me.
era. I mean, I used to be a prosecutor in a former life, and I was
Former life.
okay.
That's a unique interpretation of what you do for a living.
All right,
That's the
fair
most.
He
enough.
doesn't like this guy.
That
was funny, though.
There was something called pen registers
Yeah.
in the old
Yeah.
days, which said that I could just without any warrant get the phone numbers that somebody dialed. I couldn't I couldn't listen to the phone conversation without a warrant, but I could get the numbers they dialed because the dialers shared the number with the phone company. That was the rationale. Therefore, there was no right to privacy. And that old-fashioned exception where the FBI agent would have to follow up one by one on each call, and so there was actually a practical limit to how much your privacy could be invaded, has just been a massive hole blown through it because this can all be done automatically with computers, and this data, which is all shared with the internet company, can completely
That face is
And
disdain.
in fact, that's sort of the basis of
Yep.
what surveillance capitalism is right now. It's the basis of your company that you collect all this data.
It's not the basis of my company. That part's wrong.
Okay, fair enough.
I'm going to go back to that. That was important. He says collecting the data is the basis of his company.
Yes.
You're wrong. That is not the basis of my company. And
Well,
but that is.
if someone just called me a surveillance capitalist, I would interject.
Yeah, you would see.
And I'm not actually saying that's wrong, but
Yeah.
let's.
Okay,
He did clarify. That was fair enough. Hold on. Let me just go back.
Construct your life. And in fact, that's sort of the basis of what surveillance capitalism is right now. It's the basis of your company that you collect all this data.
It's not the basis of my company. That part's wrong.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, fair enough. So my question really is, do we need to kind of reconceptualize practically what the right to privacy means in this modern world where and no longer consider this data is shared just because I happen to punch in something into a search engine or visit a website. Should I genuinely own my data? Not in a kind of only if I can figure out at the bottom of all the waivers is the right thing to check, but just presumptively it's my data unless I very consciously give it to your company or some other company.
There's a lot. I agree with the gist of the question, and with great respect to the question, which I think and what you're intending to ask, it's not asked precisely enough to give you the right answer. So let me reformulate the question so that you get a technical version. So you're putting a couple things together, which is what is exactly right philosophically. There's been a move from what I would call a nodal society to a network society, where when the FBI or whatever authorities were getting the access to phone numbers, that was ethically somehow understandable, leaving the law aside, because in fact they were getting access to the numbers, they weren't getting access to you. When you move to a network society, in fact, the network of your behaviors is actually you. Like you can know more about the network than the person knows about themselves. So node to network. And this happened where you are right technically is that insight does power the way in which you do certain security. So for example, if you in cyber, if you want to know who's going where is the data, who's robbing you, that you look at the network, you don't look at the node. You figure out the node by looking at the network. You're then imposing that onto software companies in general, and that's where it goes a little wrong. And so, for example, you're taking consumer and enterprise and putting them into one bucket, where in fact, and merging distinctions that are different in America and in Europe. So in Europe, you would be protected in consumer and government interactions equal. So you have data protection as a consumer and as and in your interaction with government somewhat equally. It's not the same, obviously. If you are involved in criminal behavior, they can see the data, and you're using the ownership to. By the way, I happen to agree with you on that. Like, but it's a very subtle thing in the consumer space since you've signed up to give it to a consumer. I happen to think one of the reasons why we've been very critical of consumers, they de facto are making you into a product. They're monetizing your data, and then you're getting nothing. And in fact, they do know more about you than you know about yourself. And they're not only that, they're influencing who you are, which is has enormous political problems for democracies, which in my view you see on extremes left and right. You might just think on the right. I think in both. But but and then you're imposing that onto what we do as a completely separate thing because in fact in enterprise there are various things, but in general in enterprise, like in my case, we don't own the data, we don't collect the data, we don't keep the data, we do process the data. So now you could say a version of being critical if you accepted that architecture, which would be even a harder question, is yeah, but you don't have to own the data.
I'll stop.
For like a minute.
In fact, in enterprise, there are various things, but in general in enterprise, like in my case, we don't own the data, we don't collect the data, we don't keep the data, we do process the data. So now you could say a version of being critical if you accepted that architecture, which would be even a harder question, is yeah, but you don't have to own the data if in fact your interaction with the data is so powerful
What I want to hear.
that you get to the same place. Now, there you're doing an immoral distinction on top of a legal distinction. You can argue that. I can't tend to think that you need to look at both, but in Europe and in European law, there's a difference between the data owner and the data processor. And this is a big distinction. Just like in American law, there's a distinction between access to the data and moving the data. You could call it academic, and we could litigate that, and I'm not on either side, but that's just the way it is, and I think both make sense. Both have huge weaknesses. What you're getting at, though, are two things I broadly very much agree with. Yes, what I don't know if you can call it data ownership when you get to an anti-terror legal context where you have certain rights to get access to the data, but there should be a great deal of skepticism and rigor about what you're doing with the data, even when you, to use your model, move from I own the data to I have a warrant. The police have a warrant, can look at it, precisely because of the assumption of your question, which is that in pen testing, pen actual looking at these numbers, it's not super powerful. Whereas when the police get your, or the surveillance state gets your, as you, they actually can have insights into your movement, your data, your personal life. Is it really necessary for the government to know, who you actually see and what you're doing with them? Unless you're like some severe criminal. And then where I would say I'm very much on the advocacy side of this would be if I were a personal person, people outside the company don't always believe me, people inside the company know this is true, is, well, you're saying basically to people, trust me. But no one trusts large industry or government, certainly not in America. Actually, in Europe, it's different. People trust. But in any case, then you get to the verification. So when you move to this, there's the distinctions. The primary distinction, in my view, is under what circumstances would broader society believe it's okay to move to hyper powerful techniques. So I would say most people in society are okay with warrant-based hyperpower techniques against terror suspects, and most people do not want this against normal criminals, meaning you're stealing a piece of bread, or there being a slippage. So like what happens when they're still running this program? I mean, this is the classic migration thing. It starts with the terrorist and all of a sudden it's the political. And so that's again where I would say the way this works is people like you and me who would broadly probably disagree on a lot of issues. I assume we might agree quite a bit on how you actually get these things to work technically. And if we agreed and we were like, I trust that third party to enforce our agreement, you might find the world is a lot better place. Because in fact, technically, by the way, you could.
I think what he's talking about is the point I brought up about the tech of Palantir is, if I'm interpreting this correctly, is protecting the civil liberties that the guy's question is asking about. And his argument is, if you don't trust the government, would you trust a third party institution like a company? And I think his argument is that's why you have to build Palantir with this whole Western value ethic, because if you do trust them, they're a company, they have to make a profit. But if they're limiting their TAM by not working with adversaries, then maybe this is a better company third party to trust, especially because the government cannot build the technology to protect civil liberties. They tried it with fighting Bernie Madoff with financial fraud. They wasted $2.3 billion.
They couldn't build the healthcare.org site. Remember that in 2008? Come on, it was a website.
He didn't answer the question. Maybe he could have been more explicit, but his argument is like, look, a third party company can do it better, especially with the tech that we have.
But also,
the point of showing that clip is that
the reason. Okay, if you're making the case,
hold on, there is a point. The point is, it took 5 minutes to get to the answer, which was right at the end there.
No, but hold on. But that was a very complicated question. And the other thing is, what he was doing, there's a technique when you're debating. I'm sure you would know this. I mean, it's snuck premise. You heard the couple of snuck premises, right? So a snuck premise is when you state something in a certain way that has a spin on it, but you pass it off as if it's a given fact. The guy had a couple of snuck premises in there when he said like when your company steals the data and you keep, no, I don't steal data. So there was a few snuck premises that he needed to combat those presumptions before he could address the question that he thought was answering. I have no issues with how he answered that.
There was another tactic he used called strategic concessions. Strategic concessions in an answer to a question is conceding that you are correct about something and then disagreeing with the other part. It makes the other person feel a little bit more welcome. So when he says, you and me disagree, but we might agree on something really important. And by the way, when he says, I actually agree with you, like he's trying to say to the guy, look, you're asking me this really aggressive hyper state capitalism question. Look, we disagree, but on this part, here's the middle ground. Here's the part of the Venn diagram, but it did take him long to get there. But I don't think that taking him long to get there delegitimizes the shareholder base of the company. Like, I think it makes it.
You
guys both turned bold somehow, but the problem is trying to explain this to most people who aren't us, who aren't watching an hour and a half to get to that point to figure out what's going on. Like, Karp has lost a lot of people.
But Vitaly,
there is no simple answer to that question. Honestly, question.
I agree. I'm just saying it just always is a diatribe. It's always a diatribe.
Here's what you're missing. Even if he had said that in 30 seconds in the most pristine answer in the world, they would not get the distribution for the stock price. The stock price will move up when this runs to 20 on institutions buying, and then all those other people that are going to come are going to watch my videos about breaking this stuff down in simpler terms. If he made it simple, it doesn't move the needle. In fact, it might make it worse because there's not an actual real philosophical explanation. So to me, it's like you're asking for this really small explanation of how to do it in 30 seconds. I'm like, well, that's not going to do anything for the share price regardless. So you might as well take an hour, because you and me are going to analyze it. And then our videos will get distribution for them, which they should work on their own stuff as well, when the stock price surges up. But the stock price not moving, and it's not going to move until growth. This 30-second explanation is not going to get 1,000 people to buy 2 billion outstanding.
I agree with you there. Let's go to Kathy Wood.